My name is Jason White. I'm the founder, president, and CEO for the National Reentry Workforce Collaborative. And I'm super excited actually to have this conversation today. We have three very dynamic panelists. We're excited to dig into this conversation. Our topic for today is optimizing fair chance hiring employer relationship. And I'm convinced, folks, that the relationship with the employer is one of our key relationships. I mean, all services in reentry workforce is important, but this relationship is particularly important, and oftentimes it is significantly underutilized. So we here at NRWC are excited to bring you this topic because we really want to share different practices that we believe would be helpful for you to optimize this relationship. And today we have three dynamic panelists that will be sharing their thoughts. And we are going to be considering some things around building cross-functional buy-in to get organization-wide buy-in from employers. We're also going to be addressing turnover of champions. So those individuals who are championing the effort of fair chance hiring and how to engage with these individuals, among other things. So at this time, I would actually like to invite our panelists to come on the screen. We're going to be joined today by Molly, Lisa, and Sarah, and I'm excited for them to introduce themselves. But before we do that, I do want to just share a few things. Today is meant to be a very engaging session, so we want to invite all of your questions, and you can do that by submitting your questions in the Q&A pod. So please do that. We will have a Q&A session at the end. However, as your questions come to your mind, do not want you to forget it, so please do submit it. And then we will keep track of those questions and try our best to respond. At the end of the session, we want to hear from you. So there'll be a survey that will be popping up on your screen. If you could just respond to those questions, it will literally take about a minute or two for you to respond, and that feedback is super helpful to us. Anyway, without further ado, I want to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over to Molly. Molly, could you go ahead and introduce yourself? And then after that, you could pass it on to Lisa and then to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason. Can you hear me okay?
Hearing you well.
Excellent. My name is Molly Verghese. I serve as the Workplace Solutions Lead for an organization called Cara Collective, which is a workforce development organization that has been around for over 30 years. I serve specifically on the Cara Plus team, which is our national expansion arm. And so if Cara Collective as at large is doing workforce development practitioners and work with individuals and trying to get kind of one-on-one connections, individuals to jobs, Cara Plus is really doing the organizational wide work, working with employers and workforce development practitioners to think about practice change and think about how we can make organizational shifts. And so I serve as the Workplace Solutions Lead. I've been in this work for about 1.5 years here at Cara. And prior to that, have done my master's in social work and business, focus in reentry always. And so just excited to be here. And I'll pass it to Lisa.
Awesome. Thank you, Molly. Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Durkin. I'm a director with Jobs for the Future Center for Justice and Economic Advancement. Jobs for the Future is a national workforce and education nonprofit that focuses on helping people facing systemic barriers access quality jobs. And the Center for Justice and Economic Advancement is specifically focused on access to quality jobs for people with records. My team, our employer change team, is specifically focused on supporting fair chance employers or those who are interested in becoming fair chance employers with really instituting best practices and how they recruit and how they onboard and how they advance employees with records. Previous to my work at Jobs for the Future, I was in reentry for my full career, specifically most recently managed a program back in St. Louis that helps cultivate fair chance employers and connect them to job seekers with records that are trained through local community-based organizations. So very, very passionate about this work and excited for the conversation today. And I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Sarah George. I'm a labor and employment attorney at Husch Blackwell, which is a national law firm. We have a little over 1,000 attorneys. So my work in the fair chance space is kind of split into two portions. The first is looking at Husch Blackwell internally as an employer and looking at our fair chance hiring policies and practices, how we can refine and improve them. And then the second part is counseling employers across the country as they look to implement fair chance hiring policies, either because it's something they're moving towards as an organization or because there are particular state, local, county, other ordinances kind of mandating what background check screenings look like or fair chance hiring. So those are kind of the two buckets that my work falls into. Prior to this, I worked for a couple of different federal judges, and so I was really involved in seeing how the criminal justice system worked and the systemic issues that individuals who find themselves impacted by the criminal justice system often face either prior to being impacted by the system or after they have been impacted and are trying to reintegrate into society. So that is kind of the foundation for what's really driven the work that I do now. And I'm happy to be here along with Lisa and Molly and Jason.
Awesome. Folks, again, I'm super excited to have this conversation. Very, very privileged to have these three speakers here with us. Sarah, we're going to start with you. I was so excited when I learned about your firm, especially because it's in a legal space, right? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Would love to hear how Husch Blackwell started or why they started. Maybe how did you get organizational wide buy-in? What maybe is the role of CBO and anything else you'd like to share as it relates to your the fair chance hiring journey of your company. And as you're talking, if you could talk up a little bit louder, that would be great.
Yeah, can you hear me better if I talk at this volume?
That's a little better.
Let me see if I can adjust things while I talk. I have a
Okay.
little too, so apologies. So Husch Blackwell's journey started before my time, which is exciting, and I did not know that when I first started along this journey. It actually, for me, first, I kind of walked into this space when I was advising a client who was looking at implementing fair chance practices, and they kind of wanted a legal perspective on risk and next steps and kind of how to introduce this to their team, how to introduce it through the process of hiring, the application interview, all the way through integration into the workforce. So I started digging into this, asking questions, and then came across Jobs for the Future and the work that they are doing, specifically their corporate cohort. And so we started brainstorming what this could look like to work with our clients and help them develop fair chance hiring programs. And when I took this to some of the leadership in my group in the labor and employment space, they kind of said, well, if we're going to talk to our clients about this, maybe we need to learn more about this process and go through it ourselves, which was super encouraging to have someone say, essentially, we need to practice what we preach. And so, there's a part of me that was like a little disappointed because I was like, oh, this feels like it's slowing down this momentum for how we interact with our clients. But I'm so happy that Husch Blackwell took the 12 weeks to go through this program and look at what we were doing. So one, we were already hiring individuals with records, but we were not being as intentional or thoughtful and deliberate as we could have been. And so we went through this cohort and had kind of an institutional buy-in from the labor and employment, so like the legal compliance perspective. We also had someone from our DEI and talent acquisition team as part of this cohort. And then kind of the third part of this triangle that we're building our foundation on was human resources. So having someone who's actually involved in everything from job postings to application screenings to interviews to integration. And so we kind of built this pipeline of how do we access individuals who are just as impacted, just so they're like comfortable applying and we're capturing this untapped pool of talent. Then when we get them into the process, how can we support them and let them know that this is a place that will be a great fit for them, that we're excited about them. And then from the legal space, how do we kind of combat some of the myths that surround fair chance employment, both internally, but also with the supervisors who are going to be working with these individuals, what sort of concerns do we need to anticipate, and how can we manage and proactively address that in a way that this can just be a seamless shift for our culture?
Awesome, awesome, Sarah. I am so encouraged to hear about how intentional your company has been. And one of the things that you said that stood out to me was you had this engagement with JFF, right? And it helped you to realize certain things. You were already hiring individuals, but in some regards, it creates an opportunity for you to see how to take the next step. And that being said, what I question that I just ask Molly and Lisa, you're feel free to jump in as well. But Molly, you in particular, I'm curious to find out, as your organization work with employers, how do you go about assessing them to identify where they are on their fair chance hiring journey, and maybe what are the next steps they need to take to get to the next level?
Yeah, I love this question. I love, Sarah, you're giving such a great example of what it means to like engage with an employer and see this kind of eagerness and openness to say, hey, let's assess where we are now and let's see what else we can do to make this more streamlined and from there. So just like that, I think when we work at Cara Collective and particularly on the Plus team, we're everything that we do is relational. Everything that we try to operate both with our participants and our employers is rooted in eradicating relational and financial poverty. And what does that mean for us? When we're engaging with an employer, and particularly around the topic of fair chance hiring, we're doing that within the context of building a relationship with them. And so for myself individually, as I'm working with an employer, I'm thinking about, what are your talent priorities? What are the things that you are most focused on? What are the things that keep you up at night? What are the ways that, even just contextually as in your industry, what are the things that maybe there are regulations that are contextual to your world and things like this, right? And so I want to understand first and foremost where they're sitting and what they're most focused on. And then from there, then we can start getting into some of those questions about how they approach fair chance hiring. What are their current practices and policies? How transparent are they when they communicate those kinds of things? And one of the questions we often ask is, do you consider yourself a fair chance employer right now as it stands? And oftentimes we hear from employers, they answer that in a binary answer. So like yes or no. Yeah, we're definitely fair chance friendly. Or we hear things like, well, we assess things on a case by case basis. And so my job is always to be thinking about, well, what are they trying to say here? And how can I make the implicit explicit? Because an employer answering, we assess based on a case by case basis can mean two very different things. It can mean a lot of different things, right? It can mean that they have the most robust, individualized review process. They look at things truly on a case by case basis, saying, does the conviction that we're looking at affect the role that they're applying for? They have this kind of really best practice process built out. But it also could mean the opposite, right? That we look at things on a case by case basis could be that we're asking the question to the wrong person and they don't actually know. And so we say, oh, well, maybe, we're not going to give you a full blown answer. We just want to give you kind of an answer that says, well, we'll look at things, we assess things, I promise. And then they kind of go from there. And so we don't actually get a lot of the details behind that. And the other thing that we've learned both on the workforce practitioner side is that sometimes we stop the conversation there. It might be like, okay, well, that's what you say, that's what you do. And what we do to try to assess that, like you said, Jason, your question around the needs of the employer and the degree to which they're engaged, is we want to ask that next level question. So tell us more about what that means for you to look at things on a case by case basis, or just tell us more what it means for you to be a fair chance employer. What does it look like for someone to go through your process? And the more details we can kind of gather in the early conversations, again, the more we can kind of tailor our approach to our employers. And I think that brings me to another point in this when we think about assessing and how do we understand how to move them from one step to the next. Again, implicit in that is we're on a journey. This is not a yes or no thing. This is not a we turn it on or we turn it off. It's that there are always ways that we can make our processes more comprehensive, more transparent, more accessible. And so we want to figure out what that looks like for each employer. And fair chance hiring doesn't operate in a vacuum. So one of the key things that my job is to do is to also pay attention to what are they telling me about their processes in the context of the talent life cycle. And so I think about that a lot in terms of, we had an example of an employer who said, yeah, we're definitely fair chance friendly, and we believe that our candidates are going to go through their process and successfully. But then we sent our candidates and we were realizing that they had an assessment firsthand. And before they got to the assessment, they were getting emails that were getting sent to spam. And that was eventually leading to somebody not responding within the time period, and they got eliminated out of the process. So they weren't even making it to the background check process. So what are the other barriers that show up that we want to make sure we pay attention to? So there's a lot that we can talk about, but just to kind of summarize that, I think when we think about assessing the needs of our employers, it's meeting them where they are, it's putting things in the context of relationship, and it's also asking them, not only how can we move you to the next step, but also what does that mean in the context of what our candidates might go through with you.
Yeah, awesome. Molly, as I was listening to you talk, man, I'm so encouraged and impressed by the depth to which your organization go. But one of the things that I notice is a common thread across everything that you're saying. You're going to touch on relationship and the other elements that you look for are as questions, right? To get to the heart of how to serve the employer, it's very important. Unfortunately, a lot of times us in this space, we talk so much about our mission and what we're about that we forget to ask the questions. So I'm encouraged to hear you share and demonstrate that. So thank you so much. All right, so we build a relationship with the employer, right? We assess the employer's needs, and now we're engaging with them. Now, the big question, and I'll just throw this over to Lisa and Sarah, and it's unique because you've worked together before. I guess the question that I'd like to ask is, how do you get organization-wide buy-in, right? And I think even Molly alluded to it, that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? So how do you actually get organization buy-in? Because if that's not the case, then it's bound to falter at some point in time. So Lisa, Sarah, curious to hear your response to that question.
Yeah, happy to start, and then would love to hear more about Sarah's Husch Blackwell experience. But yeah, I love this question because I think, coming from a reentry background, it is so easy to get in the door with an employer, which feels like already a monumental effort, right? Like even to make one really strong relationship with an employer is really hard. And so the idea of like, oh, now we have to multiply that over and over again to truly get organization-wide buy-in can feel very overwhelming. But it is so important because, as I often say, like one weak link in the fair chance employment thread can throw off the whole thing. And that's not to take away from the fact that this is a journey, right? And employers are always evolving and are always going to have things that can be improved on. But just to tell a quick story that kind of showcases the importance of organization-wide buy-in. In my last role, I was working closely with a national hotel chain that had locations all across the country. And their HR team was actually really strong in terms of having, best practices in fair chance hiring. They evaluated on a case-by-case basis, but like from the first version of that Molly shared, where they truly have, we're looking at each role individually and trying to understand if an offense was actually relevant to the role at hand. But the challenge they had was truly making sure that everyone in each of their hotel locations across the country was on board. So usually this wouldn't be an issue, right? Because the hotels are the ones who are doing the interviews. They're not doing the background checks. But sometimes it comes up in an interview. Sometimes a job seeker will volunteer this information as a way to try to be proactive and get ahead of it. So I actually had a situation where, one of the job seekers I had sent to this hotel volunteered this information when they were talking to a local hotel manager. And the hotel manager said, "Oh, sorry, we don't hire people with records." Which wasn't the truth. I worked closely with their HR and I knew that they did. And so thankfully, I was able to check in with this person, find that out, go back to HR, and HR was able to talk with that manager and get them on the same page. But it just goes to show, like, it is so easy for communication to not trickle down and to not, trickle across the country, especially in some of these large Fortune 500 companies. And so it is so important to make sure that the champions that you are working with are able to equip those in their company with the knowledge and the talking points that they need to really be a part of these fair chance policies. So what does it actually look like to get that buy-in? So we do a couple things at JFF. So one of the things we do, Sarah mentioned our Fair Chance corporate cohort, which is a deep dive, 8 weeks long now. Used to be 12 weeks when Sarah did it. But it goes into, best practices of fair chance hiring, including getting organization-wide buy-in. But we actually require that organizations bring 3 people as part of that, and rather than just one. Part of that is so if someone leaves the organization, you have multiple other contacts. And so the work does not stop just because one person left. And we also ask specifically for 3 different organizational units. So we ask for HR, we ask for an operational leader, we ask for one other person that we usually recommend is from legal, so that we have that representation and that they can begin working together cross-functionally from their different perspectives to figure out how to make sure that others representing their unit are going to be receiving the messages that they need. But then it's important to not stop there, right? Because maybe in some small businesses, 3 people are involved in hiring, but in Fortune 500 companies, it's literally hundreds of people who are involved in the hiring process in some ways. So it's really important to make sure then that group of champions, those 3 people, are equipped to build other champions. And so part of what we do through our cohort is identifying what are the key stakeholder groups in your company that need to be on board, and what are the key messages that they need to hear. And that is going to vary based on the stakeholder group. So Molly mentioned like pain points, right? What keeps them up at night? So it's thinking about each different group and what keeps that group up at night. So for hiring managers, that's probably going to mean they're going to need messages related to lowering turnover, right? That's usually something that's a major pain point for people who are hiring managers. High performance is also going to be really compelling for them. Whereas the legal team, they're probably thinking a little bit more about risk, right? And wanting to have as little risk as possible in the hiring process and to avoid a lawsuit, as well as to be legally compliant in their practices. So different messages are going to appeal to these different audiences. So we work with the champions that we have to tailor messaging to each of these stakeholder groups and have a set of talking points that they can use to really build those champions, knowing that we individually are not going to be able to talk to hundreds of people, but if you build champions within the company, they will be able to help build more champions and multiply that fair chance impact.
Wow, Lisa, I love the intentional investment that you make in cultivating these relationships. And in some cases, these individuals become champion, as you mentioned, in the workplace. I'm curious to hear even if Sarah have any thoughts on this. So you invest the time, you develop a relationship. This person's a true champion, willing to move mountains for you, for the sake of the program internally if needed. But then the champion, actually life happens, and then they have to move on, right? How can you work proactively, I should say, to mitigate some of the impact that may result as a result of a champion moving on?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think Molly and Lisa have already alluded to this. So I just want to reiterate what they've already said so eloquently, is that fair chance hiring is a process. And with all processes, there's got to be patience over time, because otherwise, you have buy-in at the start and then the enthusiasm fizzles out and the movement dies. And that is the opposite of what we want to have happen here. And so I feel like this has been kind of the theme with Husch Blackwell's journey, is learning patience along the way and navigating the challenges. And one, I think having multiple individuals bought in keeps that energy alive. So if it was just me on my own, I would I'm generally an optimistic person, but I feel like there would have been points along this journey where I'm like, no one cares. I'm the only one doing this. Why are we still doing it? Right. But the fact that I can lean on my colleagues who are, seeing different sides of the business and saying, like, we've got some traction here. Like, here's what I think we need to do next. Or in our talent division saying, like, we're starting to target recruiting in these areas. How can we expand to fair chance? That sort of teamwork, one, keeps energy going, but 2, also helps me understand parts of the business that I'm not privy to. And so building that team just gives a really solid foundation. And then anecdotally, our team went through the cohort. We were ready to present. We had identified who was the first group of individuals that we needed to talk to about this. And we decided it was our senior leadership team because they handle all of the business side hiring. And that's where we felt like the greatest opportunity to introduce strategic, big scale fair chance hiring was. So we went through this hour-long pitch. We got asked some really tough questions. We were prepared to answer them because we had gone through, what are the pain points and what's keeping them up at night and how do we talk to them in a way that meets them where they are, right? So we did that. We were so encouraged. And then a week later, like the senior leadership head of all HR was put in his resignation notice. He retired to go live happily with his wife and kids and grandkids. And so that felt like a little bit of a setback, We're like, we're going to keep moving forward. And then 3 weeks later, the firm announces this organizational shift where the entire HR and talent and acquisition is going to be shifted to fit under this new organization. And it was kind of unclear. So we thought, okay, let's push pause on this, right? Because the last thing we want to do is rush into it and then miss the people who are coming in and not have the right buy-in, and this gets lost in the shuffle. So for a period of probably 6 months, we were in this waiting game of getting a new CEO, getting a new chair of the board, getting a new chief people officer. So all of these roles shifted. And so that was interesting to sit there and wait for the dust to settle. But the really cool part of that is this core group that had been established throughout this same time period, we were all promoted within our individual roles. And so we were able to gain more space to talk about these opportunities. And so now we're at a point where the dust has settled. I have been working with kind of the transitions that have happened in the attorney space. Our talent and DEI champion has been working with her new supervisors and how their structure has changed. And then our HR person has been in the ear incessantly in the best way possible with our new chief people officer. And so the fact that we all have been able to stay in the ears of the new stakeholders and kind of keep this momentum going, even though it's a little slower and a little more under the radar, we're now at a point where we're like, okay, let's pick up where we left off. We still have the team, we still have the enthusiasm, and we know what it's going to look like in this circumstance. And so for me, that's just been so encouraging to see what worked for us is not what's going to work for every employer, right? But when you build a team, you can kind of navigate some of these things that may initially feel like failures, setbacks, delays, frustrations, whatever you want to label it, but can actually open the door to opportunities you didn't anticipate in a way that I'm very hopeful that Husch Blackwell's fair chance process is going to be bigger and better than we could have anticipated when we first did this pitch. And I think that sort of encouragement is what I want to really convey today, that it's a process. It's not a yes or a no, we're a fair chance employer. It's a yes, we are, and here's where we are, and here's what we're going to keep doing, and here's what we still struggle with, being transparent about that, but knowing that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. That's been our journey, at least, and I think that is something that a lot of employers should anticipate and know that it's not a bad thing.
Sarah, if I could quickly jump in, I'm curious if you'd be willing to share a little bit about how long in these new leaders' tenures it took you to be able to start approaching them, because I've seen it both ways, where on one level, the sooner you do it, the more just ingrained it is for them, and they don't learn another way of doing things. They're just like, oh, we're Husch Blackwell, we're a fair chance employer, of course we are. Whereas, obviously you don't want to bombard an employer necessarily, or a leader necessarily right when they start. So curious about how you thought about that and what that journey looked like for you.
Yeah, so we tried to be strategic about this because you're right. We didn't want to overwhelm them and say, congrats on your new role. We need to talk to you about this new initiative. We have a 60-slide PowerPoint for you to see, but it kind of happened more organically in the initial conversations of, hey, so glad you're here. Tell me about what you do. What's your vision for this? Here's what I do. And then kind of opening the door to here's what I do when it comes to advising and counseling. Here's what I do when it comes to litigation. Also, by the way, there's this fair chance work I've been doing. And so the three of us kind of slotted that into the introduction conversations of, and by the way, this is something we're doing. If you have questions, I'd love to talk to you more. And the response in every single case was, oh, that's interesting. I don't know what that is. Tell me more about it. And then to be able to say, well, it's something we're already doing now, because that lowers the threat of a new idea for a new leader. We're already doing it. So we're actually looking to revise, and it's helping us, engage with our clients, make sure that we're compliant, legally speaking. But also it's just really opened the door to some good communications. And so trying to present it in a way that was not overwhelming, but also this is kind of a low risk, you should be excited about it, opportunity, that has worked well for us. And
Awesome.
courses we need to really push that messaging, because we had thought about it for 12 weeks, many months.
Awesome, Sarah. Thank you so much for that insight that you shared there. It's amazing how strategic and intentional you and your team have been to navigate some of the organizational shifts and even personal changes that we've experienced. So thank you so much for that talk. Folks, if you're on this webinar and you would like to ask a question, please do not forget. Listen, we're going to keep going if you guys are not asking any questions. So if you have a question, please don't hesitate to ask. I noticed that there's 2 questions now. So yeah, please go ahead and ask your question. We'd love to get to it. We're gonna spend a few more minutes continuing our conversation, but probably about 15-20 minutes at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. All right, that being said, this one is a very interesting one, and I'm going to use some for-profit language here, right? In Fair Chance Hiring, you have 2 customers, right? And the practitioner, the provider is in the middle, balancing the tension between the needs of the employer and also the needs or the opportunity that the job seeker is seeking. Molly, I'm curious to ask you, how do you strike that balance, right, between serving these 2 client-based, customer-based, or relationships that you have to manage?
Yes, I love this question, and I'm probably going to sound a little bit like a broken record, because unsurprisingly, I think the core to my answer is also about relationships. But I say that because it's just like with anything, in any interpersonal relationship, we think about getting to know our customers, to use that language, or getting to know our stakeholders, and understanding what they need, what they want, what are their priorities. And so at Cara, we think about this in 2 particular ways. We have a really unique team, our employment services team, that is really situated between our candidates, our participants, and our employers. And I've learned so much from them. And so there's 2 key ways that we engage with this, right? So one of them is something like on our Cara Plus team. I'll talk about that first with the employers themselves. One of the ways that we think about engaging with them is through direct practice change. So if we know that, hey, Sarah, you were just talking about this, hey, we had somebody, we're in a hiring pause right now, we have a transitional leadership, we're trying to figure this out, we're not gonna push the employer to be like, well, you still need to be getting all these other things in charge, right? Part of it is just relationally understanding, hey, we understand that it feels like right now the momentum is really, really slow. So how do we still make progress towards something? Understanding ways that we can ask them, again, asking questions, getting in with them in that way. And sometimes it's, what are the things we can do in the interim, and thinking about building up. So, hey, let's look at your job description. Let's think about how your communications plans are looking. Let's get into some of the nitty gritty, but that's in the context of working directly with the employer and getting some of those direct things that they can do to understand their needs and help them take the next step. What I think is really interesting about the second part of this question is balancing that tension. So when I have a candidate need and they want to move into a job, for example, what we are constantly doing is thinking about where is the employer as we might assess them. And so, and part of that is how far along are we in this relationship? If we have a brand new employer that we just kind of met and they want to become an employment partner with us, and they may or may not know much about their background check processes or the specific roles and how they intersect, we take that into consideration. And instead of pushing the employer to say, you need to do X, Y, or Z, we flipped the perspective and we talk about prioritizing the candidate experience. And what I mean by that is, we know our candidates, we know our participants, right? And so I might have a candidate where there's a role from this brand new relationship employer. They put out a role and they say, we're going to hire for this role. We're not entirely sure what that background check process is going to deliver with us. We don't know if it's going to come back and if that's going to affect the possibility for employment. So if I flip that script, then I'm looking at this candidate and I'm saying, hey, I think that you have the fantastic skills that are going to be a match for this job. I think that you are not only going to be able to thrive in this, I think you're going to go through this process. But let me be honest with you. We're new to this relationship with this employer. And so we don't know if as you go through this process, you have a background and we know that and they know that. And so we're going to try to do our best to make sure you're best equipped to go through this process. There is a possibility that you go through the whole process, you get the job, and there's a rejection at the end because of this background. So that's a real possibility, especially for those employers that are not as aware of like what the direct one-to-one correlations are, right? So what does that mean? It means we have to prioritize our candidates' agency. I think that's the key ingredient for us, is saying, we're giving you the option. You don't have to put your name in the hat. You don't have to submit your application, but we want to make sure that I think you're a great fit and we think you're a great fit for this employer. And if you want to put your name in the hat, of course, we're going to be working with them on other opportunities that are a match with them. Then let's have that conversation. And if the candidate says, yes, I want to take that risk, I want to see what that looks like because I love this job, I'm excited to work with this employer, let's see what happens. Let's say we go through the process and it turns out they go through the whole process, they're a good fit for the role, they get that, and then the rejection comes through from a background. Well, now we have that data to then use as leverage with the employer. And I think that that's really, really important. What I mean by leverage is we get to use that as feedback. Oftentimes employers are like, well, we don't know what happens. Well, now we have a data point. Now we have an experience that can tell you, hey, we sent this candidate. Again, we gave them the agency, we prioritized that. So that's the balancing of the different tension. And they got rejected in the end, but they proved to be a great fit for this role. Can we double click into this now and understand a little bit as to what happened? What might have gotten in the way of them accessing this role? Do we really think that this conviction from 20 years ago is affecting their capacity to complete the role and your job now? How might we think about the processes and the practices, right? So when I think about balancing tension, it's a couple of those things. It's number one, it's prioritizing the candidate experience, and it's also giving that active feedback to the employer as we get more and more experience. And then the second thing I'll say is, let's say we're later on in a relationship with an employer, but we still are learning, what are they prioritizing? I've seen this a lot of times with employers where they'll say, we do things on a case-by-case basis, but we need to know that the candidate has shown some sign of care, that they want to change their behavior and they're going to take accountability for their actions. And this is the kind of language we might hear from an employer of how they want to go out. And Lisa, you made me think about this when you were sharing about those candidates that want to self-disclose and say, well, I have this background and I'm willing to own it, right? The more we get to know about our employer and what they are looking for, and if we know that that's something that they're looking for, we're also doing the prep work with our candidates on the interview side to say, just so you know, this employer is really looking for the data to say, they want to know that you've made changes in your life. They don't need to know what you did or why you did it or anything like that. It's what are you doing now to say, and so we'll prep them in that way to make sure that they're well equipped when they're going into that interview place and feeling that. So we're balancing and listening for the needs of our employers. We're prioritizing and supporting the needs of the candidates and seeing where those two things can meet. And then again, constantly thinking about that feedback loop to say, hey, this person went through this experience, or even what I was alluding to before, hey, the background didn't even become a problem because your assessments weren't even allowing our candidates to get through, or whatever it might look like, right? But giving that feedback constantly to the employer. It's not an easy thing, but I would say it's a really big art to be able to consistently do. And we're constantly learning ourselves, but I think it's critical to, again, kind of prioritize and respond to the agency of our candidates as much as it is to adapt our processes for our employers.
Molly, as I was listening to you talk and you use the term art, it does sound like an art, for sure, an art of managing these relationships, right, and balancing these needs. One of the things that I like that you emphasize is the idea of a match, right? And I think that's kind of the sweet spot, I would say, of managing these two relationships. So thank you so much for sharing that and everything else that you share. I do have one question I'm going to pull in just for yourself and Lisa and Sarah, feel free to chime in here. But I think Molly sets this up real well. Mark Soicher have this question. He says, how do you define progress or success and how do you actually measure that? Molly, I thought it makes sense, especially because you talk about this balance between the two, right? So how do we measure success?
Oh, I love this question. We think about it so often. We also have a fair chance hiring cohort and we talk about measurement all the time. And I think about this in a couple of different ways. I think because this is a journey, to me, success looks like meeting someone where they are and taking the next step. And if we can define what that is as best we can with the employer, that is also another really key ingredient to thinking about what success looks like. So it's hard to say these like blanket statements of like, yes, in a dream world, success would look like the employer can accept people with they're mindful of the communications about them. They have this built out and robust program and they're part of the movement and all the things, right? But we know that practically that doesn't even look the same within each industry, let alone thinking about this. And so when I think about success, that's part one. And then I think about another part of that is this iterative process. So one thing that I heard, Sarah, that you shared that was so critical is an openness to evolve. And so a willingness to say, hey, this is where we are today. We're going to name it. We're going to mark the stake and say, yes, right now we do not accept people with this kind of background, whatever it might look like. I don't know, I'm making this up. But at the same time, we're saying, hey, I'm willing to move along that spectrum to say, here, these are the practices that we can change, or these are the changes that we can see that would have this impact. And of course, I mean, long-term success is that the more people that we can give chances to, first chances and first, options, I think is going to be. But I'm curious, Lisa, what would you add to that?
No, I love everything that you said. And I think, as you said, it is a journey and it is full of like small steps along the way. And I think where people can get discouraged is if they aren't measuring those small steps along the way. So they just think, oh, no progress is happening. We're not going anywhere. When in reality, there actually may be some subtle progress. But if you don't know how to measure that, then it can just feel, you can just feel very pessimistic about it. So a few different types of progress that I think about measuring. I think the first kind is really knowledge and belief change. So that usually happens very like early in a fair chance journey when people often don't even know what is fair chance hiring and have a lot of stigma and bias usually against people with records. And there's a lot of learning that needs to happen there about what really is the risk of hiring people with records. And I'm sure many people on this call are familiar with the data that shows actually the risk is incredibly low. People with records are no more likely to be fired for workplace misconduct, and negligent hiring lawsuits are very rare. So like just familiarization with that kind of data about the low risk and then conversely the positive benefits in terms of lower turnover, high performance, impact on the bottom line, et cetera. So like knowledge and belief change is kind of that first step. And if you can measure that within your company and show like, oh, wow, 80% of people now believe that it is a positive thing to hire people with records, that's a really important first step. And then after that, you start to look at practice change. Now that everyone believes this is a good thing that we should do, how do we actually change our practices to reflect that? How do we rewrite our job descriptions? How do we institutionalize individualized assessments so that we are, looking at background checks as trying to understand whether or not this offense is actually related to the job and moving people forward when their offense is not related to the job or has been a really long time ago. So, practice change, I think, is kind of the next bucket that's important to measure beyond knowledge and belief change. And then after that, hopefully you start seeing some individual level outcomes in terms of hiring and advancement and retention. So I think those are the three buckets, but I think people often jump to that last one and then they don't see the progress along the way because it really is a journey. And especially the larger the company, the slower the progress usually because more people have to be involved and there's more knowledge and belief change that has to happen because, as I said before, hundreds of people are involved in hiring. So it's just really important to take those baby steps and to measure and celebrate progress along the way so that people can understand that this initiative is having impact and continue to sustain it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Lisa. Thank you. Sarah, go ahead.
Sorry. I just have one small thing to add that sometimes success is just putting a follow-up on the calendar for 3 months out and then actually sticking with it and saying like, you know what? We're not going to let this go. We're going to be proactive while we can. And then what I found is when that 3 month or 6 month or whatever check-in happens, the conversations about, actually, let me tell you about what came up over the last 3 months that I didn't anticipate. I met with this employer who's doing this in a similar way, and I think we could really learn from that. Or, oh my gosh, I met someone in this space doing this. So being able to reflect on some of those kind of unexpected successes, even in a period of waiting, I think is success in and of itself.
Awesome. Wonderful. Listen, guys, the questions are flowing in, so this is exciting. We'll try our best to get through as many as possible. I'm going to ask this question from Ty Reed, actually. And the reason why I'm going to ask it is a good follow-up to what you just said, Sarah. You talked about success being having the door open, right, to follow up and have continued conversation. The question that Ty has is, what percentage of time do you think should spend on initiating new relationships versus actually cultivating some of the current relationships that currently exist? Curious to hear if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I can just share a few thoughts on this. I think just being open to figuring out how fair chance conversations fit into everyday conversations. And so what I found is that I keep in touch with the people that I know are stakeholders, right? Maintaining those relationships. But I am happy to talk to anyone who comes my way. Like, oh, you have an employer in California. What are they doing with fair chance hiring? Have they thought about that? If not, like, that's something we can definitely walk them through. Or, oh, your company was just in the news about this. Like, what about, this opportunity for fair chance? So I feel like the answer is all of the time, but try to make it as organic as possible, So figure out, like, fair chance hiring fits into every aspect of life. And so figuring out how to integrate it just into your conversations. And then it's not like, oh, I have my 3-hour block where I'm going to talk to new people about fair chance hiring. Like, that is an important, there's a time and a place for that. But I also think that making it organic is really, really important.
Yeah, I love that. That just naturally think about that as you go about your day. That doesn't necessarily need to be like specific time allocated. It can just come up in relationship. I think another tricky aspect of this question is that the percentage is probably going to vary depending on what kind of program you have. So for example, if you have a program that is specifically training people to get CDL licenses, then you probably, it probably makes sense to have a handful of employers that hire, people with CDL licenses and really invest in those because you have that specific niche. Whereas if you have people looking for a wide variety of industries, you're probably going to need to spend more of your time cultivating new relationships because you want to represent the wide variety of interests that the job seekers in your program might have. But I definitely want to kind of double click on Molly's earlier point about like how important it is to maintain relationships. That like the longer you have a relationship with an employer, the more feedback you get and the stronger that's going to be, and the better you're going to be able to place people, and you're going to have more trust there, and you're just going to be able to get more people through the process more reliably. So definitely think that is usually something we don't think about enough. I think in the reentry world, I know I personally, my orientation tends to be toward hustling just to build new relationships, but that maintenance is so important through proactive checking.
Absolutely.
I know we're going to get to another question. I think the only other thing that I wanted to add into this is it's when we think about what it means to manage a relationship versus adding these net new, I think it also kind of inherently recognizes that the state of that relationship or the state of that employer, for example, will evolve and will change. So they might go through the ebb and the flow where they're on a hiring pause. Well, we try to do a lot of work at Cara where we have cross-functional kind of teams and collaboration. So, hey, they're on a hiring pause, so they're not actively hiring our candidates at this moment. What else can we do to build that relationship? How might we think about what we can do in that lag time or the time that we're not hiring to continue to build momentum with that relationship? So that's when maybe the plus team comes in and says, hey, let's check in about some technical assistance, or let's talk about some other ways that we can engage you to think critically so that as soon as you are, and this hiring pause ends, we're ready to hit the ground running and even more effectively next time. So I think the more you can build the systems internally to create that dialogue, I think it also helps in terms of the managing. And then we also have, we're also working in lockstep with our development team, our business development team, where we're thinking about what are those new relationships and how do we fold them into this kind of integrated system? And so there's some intention behind both of those, but I think it's a great question to be asking.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. There's actually a question here from Savannah High, and I'm asking this question because of some of what you just shared, Molly, but it's directed towards Sarah, but feel free to jump in, anyone who wants to. We talked about champions earlier, right? So I guess the question that Savannah is asking here is, when you're engaging in those conversations, what do those conversations actually look like? What are maybe some action items? And I know it may vary depending on where they are in that conversation, but just curious if you have one or two thoughts that you want to share here with Savannah.
Yeah, I think the first step is to understand who you're talking to. What's their role? What space are they operating in? Because that opens the door to the angle and approach you're going to take. So someone who is over finances, I'm going to approach differently than someone who is in our DEI space, because I know their own goals are different. I mean, there's some overlap, obviously, with overall business growth and development. But I think what someone in the DEI space is going to connect with in terms of how fair chance fits into their role is going to be different than how someone in the finance side of things, what fair chance means for them and how it's important to them. So being strategic in what those conversations look like takes a little bit of homework on your end, looking at who they are, who they work with, like looking up the chain, like who do they supervise or who supervises them, but also looking at who they supervise if it's someone they supervise, because that'll help orient you to, the landscape you're walking into and how to best approach that. I also think it's good to just ask them, like, tell me what you do and what your goals are and how you see yourself, just generally at Husch Blackwell, because then I think if you listen closely, you'll pick up on some things that as you navigate building a relationship, you'll be able to lean into as time.
The only other thing I'd add to that too is how do you get people proximate? I think a lot of times that we think about the champions that are there, one of the biggest things that we've learned in our cohort that people take is or take from it is when we have our lived experience panel, when we have folks explaining and getting in relationship and say, this is what I've lived, this is how I've been in this experience. And then all of a sudden you have a new champion because they're like, I had no idea. I had no idea all the barriers that you were facing to get through this process. I had no idea that X, Y, or Z. What can I do to make a difference? And so once you get people in relationship to each other, you have different avenues to get kind of exactly what you were saying, Sarah, kind of different avenues to not only prioritize what they're thinking and how they think and what they prioritize, and then also get them in relationship to folks who can kind of explain to them there's more to this story than maybe what meets the eye.
Man, Molly, you're setting these questions up well, very, very well. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question here from Grace, and part of the reason why I'm asking this question, you talk about the Fair Chance hiring panel, right? But in some cases, there's this tension or struggle with keeping the background, so to say, invisible when you come on to engaging with HR professionals. Just curious, and I'm trying to synthesize the question, but I'm very, very curious. Is there any advantage with trying to keep someone's background concealed, so to say, or not disclosing that? And if so, what's the advantage? Or is it, in your experience, is there any approach with keeping someone's background quiet, so to say? Is it helpful at any point in time?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this one. It's a complicated one, right? Because on one level, you never want to push someone to talk about their background early, and to be legally compliant now with ban the box laws, it's required that employers wait until after they have made a conditional offer to run a background check. So as a result, you never want to encourage a job seeker to to disclose that early. And you never want to encourage an employer to ask about that before the background check. But sometimes what that means, to Grace's question, is sometimes the job seeker doesn't have an opportunity to share about more context. Like, it just means that someone is reading their background check, seeing these words on a page, often doesn't understand what they mean because it's legalese, and no one actually looks at charges and truly understands what that means. And usually there's so much more to the story than what you see on the page, and that is a loss for that job seeker to not be able to share that. So I think a huge part of this is where the relationship comes in that Molly and Sarah have been speaking to. Is that like preempting that by, when you're asking those early questions about their process, trying to understand, like, does the candidate have an opportunity, to talk to you about this after you've run the background check, after you've made the conditional offer? And even, going so far as to request from them, like, we just ask that before eliminating someone from consideration because of their background, you would at least give them the opportunity if they would like to have the conversation. Because of course, a job seeker might not want to have that conversation, and we should never be forcing that. But if they want to have that conversation, asking that the employer give them that opportunity to provide some context and hear them out before eliminating them from consideration.
Absolutely, Lisa. Thank you so much for sharing that. It is a delicate dance and balance from time to time. So thank you for really helping us to think through that tension. I have a question here that I think is very important. Oh, go ahead, Sarah. Please.
But I also think, Lisa, everything you said is so accurate. But I just want to also underscore, like, a background check doesn't give you, like, even a felony versus a misdemeanor classification. Like, felony may just be because something was over $200. In some states, that's a felony, which is like this big, bad, scary word, right? So, like, getting away from leaning on the words in a background check, like, it's not helpful to, like, treat that with some cautious distance.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Molly.
I just get excited. I also want to underscore, without dismissing the reality that the barriers that folks have and wanting to be able to explain their story. I think the other side of that is also the narrative we also want to place is that you are qualified for this job. Like, if you have these skills and you have the things that match up to this job description, your background should not be the thing that keeps you from accessing it, right? And that's what we're working on the employers to see, and we're working with you. And so some of that is also just the confidence building and working with folks to say, you have the skills, speak about the skills, speak about the things and the reasons why you are capable of doing that. And I don't want to lose sight of that either, because if we focus too much or we over index on this is the mistake I made and how I've made all of the et cetera, I think really wanting to emphasize how important that it is that they deserve to take up that space.
Absolutely, Molly. I couldn't agree with you more. One of the things that we encourage organizations that work with companies to do is to understand that they're actually bringing the most valuable asset to the employer, right? And while there are other things that could be a part of the conversation, you want that to be the core driver for engagement. So thank you for sharing that. There's a question here that I gotta ask because it's so important. Because if you do this work for 5 minutes, you'll realize that you're running problems from time to time, right? And those problems could happen in so many different ways. So I guess the question that I have to ask is, what are some of the things that you do when problems happen in your engagement and your management of these relationships? And again, we could roll off a list of different problems, but I'm just curious to hear, is there one or two things that you think are important for you to consider when some unforeseen circumstances come up that are inconvenient or challenging?
Yeah, I'm happy to start and then pass over to Molly, since I know Molly has a lot of experience here too. But I do think one thing that helps a lot when challenges do arise is, as much as possible, to preempt them through that proactive relationship and doing regular check-ins. So things are going to go much better when you have a problem if you've already been checking in, if you find out about it before it has erupted into a full-blown crisis, and you're able to maybe take some small steps to address it early. And part of that too is, like, making sure that you manage employers' expectations from the beginning, and that they understand that challenges could arise. Because I think when we're in selling mode, we're trying to, prove to employers that fair chance hiring is great. It can be easy to oversell and say like, everything will be perfect. This, will be the best hires you ever had. And like, sometimes that's true, but, humans are humans. And usually there's going to be challenges just like there is with any other population. And so that's what the case that you want to make to employers is that you're going to have no more challenges necessarily than you would with other human beings that you hire, but there will be challenges, and you get the bonus of our organization's support throughout that process. So in many cases, it's better than hiring your average human because you get the extra support of the organization that's referring them. But just like sharing what some of those challenges may be, such as, transportation challenges, childcare challenges, et cetera. And asking them to kind of rethink some of the assumptions they might have. So one of the things I've found is that employers often jump straight to nobody wants to work anymore. So if someone, misses a day of work, for example, and doesn't call, they assume that that is what's going on, when in reality, life happened, their childcare fell through and they had to, go pick up their child. And because they may not be as used to the world of work, or in some cases, cell phones, they forgot to call, like that could have been what was happening. But the employer jumps to no one wants to work anymore, immediately fires them, and then it's over. But if you have that proactive relationship and you've warned employers about potential challenges, then you can kind of preempt it, and you can ask the employer, please let us know, about a challenge before you fire someone, so that we can at least have a conversation and at least, try to resolve this amongst ourselves before making that kind of final decision. So I think that's really important, that proactive relationship. But Molly, curious to hear about your experience too.
+1 to everything you said, Lisa. I think it's so critical that we think about as however we can be proactive. And you said this from the first answer you said, which is about how are we educating. When we think about buy-in, it's about a lot of learning and a lot of unlearning for folks, and kind of navigating what that looks like. So +1 to all of that. I think there's two other things that I would add. One thing is one of the parts of our cohort we talk about is like a trauma-informed approach. And one of the things that we're asking in that trauma-informed approach is, let's be really clear about the difference between the data that you've gathered and the story that you've created. And when you start unpacking some of those things, so the data is, like you said, you give the exact example I was going to give, Lisa, like someone didn't show up for work. Well, what's the narrative that you then created? Well, they're lazy, or they don't care, or they insert anything. And this is relevant beyond just our fair chance employers, right, or employees, right? It's just about how we approach our workforce. That when we have a problem, is our approach one that assumes and creates a whole narrative about them, or is it one that looks at the data and says, okay, this is the pattern, this is the behavior? And then what we say in a trauma-informed approach is behaviors are always communication. They are a symptom of something, right? Rather than saying that they are the thing that communicates X, Y, or Z. And so how can we navigate and ask questions there? So I think that's part one. I think part two is also continuing, and Sarah, I'm sure you have some insight here around the champions of this, is, and I'm mindful of time here, but I was just talking to an employer the other day that said, we had a problem arise. They brought it up to my attention. And the first question I asked was, and so what are we going to learn from this? And just that shift in perspective in terms of, yes, the problem arise and they will continue to arise. What are we going to capture as the learning, and how can we move through this together? That's the sign of a good champion, right? Somebody that says, we're not giving up. We're not going to take this story as truth or the only truth. We're going to get curious about this and see what we can do.
Awesome. So you're right, we're right at time, but I do want to ask for a 5-second response. What's one advice you'd give to folks that are on the call as they think about engaging with employers? 5 seconds version. Lisa, Sarah, Molly.
So real quick, it's not just the right thing to do. There's a business case. Emphasize that, and emphasize relationships, and get curious, as Molly and Jason and Sarah have all talked about.
Yeah, it's
Awesome.
a marathon, not a sprint. So don't quit.
Excellent. Molly.
Meet folks where they are and take the next step with them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa, Sarah, and Molly. This was a rich conversation, and I can see that the folks who were attending really appreciate your time. And sorry we weren't able to get through all the questions, but really appreciate your engagement and involvement. We may even try something new we are planning to send out this video, I think, a week from now or so. We may try to see if we could send responses to these questions as well. See if our panelists would be willing to share their thoughts on some of the questions that we didn't get to. But again, thank you for making this a successful webinar. Thank you for coming out. We know that you have so many other things you could be doing with your time. Really appreciate it. So thanks again, presenters. Really appreciate your time and your contribution to the field. I also want to thank Kimberly for working behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Really appreciate you. All right, take care, guys.